Natalie, I will turn the floor over to you.
Thank you. I'll just share my screen. Can you see my screen all right there?
Yes, perfect.
Perfect. Let me just move you over there. Okay, so thank you, Lindsay, for inviting me to talk to you all. I'm really excited to be here with you all today. And I'm going to talk to you about some work that me and some of the other people in the lab have been doing looking at brain health in aphasia. Before I get started, just feel free to interrupt me to ask questions at any time. So you can either type your questions in the chat box, or you can just unmute yourself to ask a question. And before I tell you about this research project, I'd like just to introduce myself to you a little bit more. I know Lindsay did a great job of it there, but I just think that since I've met a few of you virtually at groups, but there's quite a lot of you that I haven't had the chance to meet yet. Hopefully that will change over the next few months. But I thought it'd be nice just for you to know a little bit more about my background, as it's a little bit different to some of the other people that you see quite often in the Aphasia Lab. So if you hadn't noticed from my accent, I'm actually from the UK. So I grew up in a town just outside of Durham, which is up in the northeast of England, up here. And then I moved to Newcastle, which is just a little bit further north, kind of up near Scotland. And there I went to Newcastle University. So there I studied psychology and biology, mainly just because I couldn't decide which of the two subjects I liked better. But when I got to the university, I realized that a lot of biology is really learning about trees and about plants and about insects. And although that was really interesting, I realized that that wasn't really what I wanted to do for my career. So the one thing that I really enjoyed about both biology and psychology was looking at the brain. So after I finished my 3 years at Newcastle, I decided to stay on for one more year at the Institute of Neuroscience, so I could focus a little bit more on researching the brain. And while I was there, I worked with other people who had different types of dementia, so people who had Alzheimer's disease or Parkinson's disease and dementia with Lewy bodies. And I really enjoyed that. So then I was lucky enough to be offered the opportunity to move to Manchester, which is just in like the west side of the UK, kind of close to Wales. So I got into a PhD program in Manchester. So that was for 4 years at the University of Manchester. So I spent those 4 years doing research related to the brain. So I worked with people who had aphasia following a stroke, and I also worked with people who had brain surgery due to epilepsy. And I was really interested in looking at the connections in the brain. So our brains are a little bit like computers, and different parts of the brain will speak to each other through connections, kind of like wires in a computer. So I was really interested in what happens when these connections get broken. So maybe because of a stroke, some of these connections might get damaged, and then how the brain can recover after that. So that was what I did there for 4 years. And then just as I was finishing up my work in Manchester, I was lucky enough to meet Dr. Friedrichsen and some of the other people in the Aphasia Lab, and had the opportunity to come and work over here. So just after a small bit of a delay stuck in the UK because of coronavirus, I managed to move over here last fall. So I feel really grateful to have got here at all, given everything going on at the minute. So it's really nice at the minute to get back into the lab and meet people face to face rather than on Zoom. So since my background is a bit more related to the brain, it's been really nice coming here and working more closely with the speech and language therapists, so I can learn a little bit more about that. And then it's also been great for me to use some of my previous experience to look more at your brain data. So I know a lot of you have been into the university to get brain scans, so I've been really, really excited to look at those in a few different research projects. So one of those projects that I want to tell you about today is one relating to brain health in aphasia. So just as an overview of the talk, I'll just start by telling you a little bit about healthy aging and what we mean by brain health. And then I'll go through a research project. So I'll tell you about the goal of the study, the methods that we used, so what we did, and then the results, and then just a little bit at the end about what this actually means. So healthy aging. So when we get older, like however healthy we are, our bodies do tend to change a little bit. So we might get some grey hairs, or we might get the odd wrinkle or two maybe. And it's exactly the same for the brain. But the older we get, the more like naturally occurring changes that we have in the brain. And this is regardless of how healthy we are. And some of these changes include like the brain just shrinking down a little bit. And that's really interesting to see. So I'd like to show you a brain scan of someone who's a young adult and someone who's a little bit older, just so you can see the difference. Now, I know some of you might have seen brain scans before, but some of you might not have done. So just to help orient you a little bit, I've just put an outline of a face here. And this is exactly what it's going to be like when you look at the brain scan. So it's as if you're looking at someone face on. So the ears will be at the side here, and the top of the head at the top, and the chin and neck at the bottom. And just so everyone knows that I'm not going to be showing any of your scans today, since that's like medical information that people might not want to share on here. So I'm just going to show some scans that have been made available online so you can see what I'm talking about. So this is the brain of someone who's a young adult. So you can see that the ears would be about here, and then the neck is at the bottom here. And then this is the skull across the top here. And I've just highlighted in yellow here the area that's the brain for you to see. And you can see in this brain scan that the brain is quite tightly packed in there. There's not really many gaps, and the brain goes all the way round to the skull at the top. So that's really great. This is what we would expect to someone who is a young, healthy adult. And then next, I'm just going to show you a scan of someone who's a bit of an older adult. So you can see the difference in this one, in that the whole brain is a little bit shrunk down, and there's more just like gaps in between the brain and the top of the skull. And between these folds in the brain, there's just like a little bit more room. So it's all just a little bit less densely packed in there. And this is all really, really normal. It happens very gradually. And it might be why we tend to get a little slower at things as we get older, or maybe a little bit more forgetful. And changes like this will happen no matter how healthy or unhealthy we are. And in the same way that we might get a little bit shorter as we get older, or maybe a little bit less strong. And that's regardless of how fit and healthy we are. So we can all expect some of these changes as we get older. So something that's a little bit different is brain health. So I just want to tell you a little bit about that. So just like the rest of our body, our brain health is also really important. And it can be linked to how healthy the rest of our body is. But just like with the rest of our body, there's no one thing that affects how healthy our brain is. There's lots and lots of different factors, and probably all these factors interact together in some way. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about some things that are linked to brain health. So one of these things is BMI. So if you have a high BMI, this can be associated with having a less healthy brain. And it's still not exactly clear how this works. It might be to do with a bit of inflammation in the brain, or it might be that if you have a high BMI, your arteries in the rest of your body might be a little bit more clogged. So the blood might flow through your arteries a little bit slower. So you might have a little bit lower blood supply in the brain. And some other factors that are similar are diabetes and high blood pressure. So they can also affect how healthy our brain is, and probably again, because they affect the blood flow to the brain. And another factor is exercise. So some previous research has found that when we do more exercise, we not only increase our overall health of our body, but also the health of our brain. But this is obviously not black and white. So some people might do loads of exercise and have a really low BMI, but still have an unhealthy looking brain, or vice versa. Someone might have high BMI, have diabetes and do no exercise, and they might have a really healthy brain. So it's quite complex, and there's a lot of other things at play, and probably things like genetics might make a difference, but these are some factors that have been found to affect brain health. So now that you know a little bit about what brain health is, I'd just like to tell you about how we actually measure brain health. So how I, as a researcher, might see how healthy a brain is. So if we were going to measure how healthy your body is, we might do tests like looking at blood pressure or heart rate or calculating your BMI. But for the brain, what we do is we look at the brain scans. So I'd just like to show you a couple of other brain scans. These ones are in a little bit of a different orientation, so from a different perspective. So these ones will be like you're looking down at someone, down through the top of their head. So I've just put an image here to help you. So there'll be the ears at either side still, and the back of the head will be at the bottom of the screen, and then the face and the nose will be at the front. And I'll leave this image on here just to help you when the brain scans come on as well. So it can be a little bit difficult to visualize otherwise. So just like in the image here, the ears will be somewhere around here. And this is the back of the head, and then the front of the head here, and then the skull going all the way around here. And you might be able to see, hopefully on your screen, these little white dots in the brain here. And these are called white matter hyperintensities. So they're like bright white regions on the brain that are filled with fluid. So instead of brain tissue there's little bits of fluid. Ideally, we wouldn't have any of these in the brain, but we've just got a few little ones here. This is quite mild. So you can see each dot is kind of separate from each other, and there's not very many of them. And generally, the more we have, the less healthy our brain is. So these are quite a good marker of brain health. So the next scan I'm going to show you has a little bit more of these. So this is what we might call moderate white matter hyperintensities. So you can see here these areas of bright white on the brain. Instead of being separate dots like this, all those dots have kind of smushed together. So it's kind of all one big part covering the brain. So that would be moderate white matter hyperintensities. And then the final scan here, you can see it's just a little bit worse. We'd call this severe. And then it looks like these regions of bright white matter hyperintensity are covering a large portion of the brain now. So these white matter hyperintensities are common in healthy aging as well. So all of us will probably get some of these at some point in our life. And generally, they're linked to slightly worse cognition. So on average, the more of these you have, you might be a little bit worse at things like memory tests or maybe attentional tests. But again, it's just on average. So because these are common in healthy aging, it can be interesting to look at these both in aging, but also in things like stroke and aphasia, because we think that maybe people who've had a stroke might have slightly more of these in the brain than people who haven't had a stroke, but we're not really sure at the minute. So I'm quite interested in looking at brain images to try and see these markers of brain health, to try and see whether brain health actually affects aphasia. Because there's been a lot of research done in brain health and normal aging, but not so much done in brain health and aphasia. So hopefully that all makes sense. Does anyone have any questions before I go on to the research project that I've been working on? Yeah, I think there's someone with a question. Do you want to just either unmute yourself or type it in the chat box?
Does sex have a difference in the progression of this condition?
It's a really great question, actually. I didn't know much about it. When I've been looking at some of my research projects, I have found that they're worse on average in females rather than males. I don't know if this is consistent, but that's what I've been seeing in our data. So that's quite interesting, yeah.
Oh. Thank you.
No problem. Any other questions? Great, well, I'll move on and tell you, oh yeah, sorry. Can see someone waving.
This is an MRI or what type of scan shows this?
Yeah, it's an MRI scan. So it's a specific type of MRI called a flare scan. So I think probably quite a lot of you will have had flare scans while you've been here, but it's not a normal. So the normal kind of scan that you would probably get is a T1. It's a kind of structural scan that you would get in the hospital. So you don't normally get this in a hospital. Okay. So you can see these on quite a few other scans. It's just this flare scan is the best one to see it in. So that's why we use that in the research.
So you just don't ask for this normally to your doctor? I mean,
No, you don't get this normally from your doctor, no.
Okay. I'd like to know why I keep forgetting things. Maybe I've got more stuff than I should, so. Okay.
Yeah, and it's quite tricky. So it might be due to these like things like brain health, but because there's quite a lot of other factors, we can't say for sure this is causing anything. So I think that's why a lot of the time doctors don't take these scans, because there's not too much we can say for sure about that.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
But worth asking. You never know. Great, so I'll just tell you a little bit about the research project now that I've told you a little bit of background about brain health and aging. So the goal of the study, so we know that the location of the stroke is really important in aphasia. So we know that people who have strokes in certain areas of the brain might have trouble, say, producing words. And if the stroke's in a different part of the brain, you might have trouble understanding words. So we know that that's a really, really important factor. But a lot of the time, we don't really take into account how healthy the rest of the brain is and whether that's important. And you can kind of think of it the same as any other physical injury. So like if you fall over and break your leg, the time that it takes your leg to heal probably depends a bit, at least, on how healthy the rest of your body is. So if your leg has really good muscles and really strong bones, you'll probably heal a little bit faster. If your other leg is really strong, it might be that you can use that more so you can rest the broken leg a bit more. And it can be exactly the same in the brain. So we think that how healthy the rest of the brain tissue is might help people heal a little bit faster after the stroke. So the aim of this project was to try and see whether brain health affected aphasia severity at all. So the methods that we used. So we had 38 lovely participants come in. So for this study, it was those of you who did POLAR, which was our big therapy study. And then a few of you came back about 6 months later to take part in LARC, which is a follow-up study. So this is using the data from LARC. And we will be doing similar projects later on with everyone who took part in POLAR as well. So in this one, we had 28 males and 10 females. And the average age was almost 60, so 58.8. And what we did is we had 4 people here at the Aphasia Lab rating the different brain scans. So for every brain scan, we'd have at least 2 people rating them for those white matter hyperintensities. And if there was a disagreement between the 2 people, we'd get a 3rd person to rate them as well, just to make sure. So exactly like I showed you before, we'd be looking for these markers called white matter hyperintensities. And the way we would do it is if we couldn't see any of these white regions at all, we'd give it a rating of 0. And then if we just saw the mild case here, where all these little regions are separate, we'd give it a rating of 1. If we thought it was moderate, so a little bit worse than the mild, we'd give it a 2. And if these bright regions covered large portions of the brain, we'd give it a rating of 3. So we go along and rate every single person's scan. And then we were interested to start off with looking at 3 different behavioural scores. So the first one was the Western Aphasia Battery, the WAB. So that's one of the studies you've probably all done lots and lots of times with us. And it gives us an idea of your overall language ability. So you have to do things like name objects, repeat words, point to pictures. And you get a score between 1 and 100, where a higher score is better. And anything below 93.8 means that you have aphasia. And we also looked at the Philadelphia naming test. So for anyone who did POLAR, you will have done this one lots of times, where you have to name different pictures. And then finally, we looked at the words per minute. So this is where you have to kind of speak out loud. So it might be describing things like a picture, or maybe describing how you would do something like making a sandwich. And this gives us an idea of how easy it is for you to speak. So if you find it quite easy to produce words, you would probably say lots of words in a minute. If you found it a little bit more difficult maybe to come up with a word, you might not say very many words in a minute. And this gives us an idea of how fluent you are at speaking. So we're interested in looking at these 3 scores. And generally, we wanted to see whether these brain health ratings related well to the behavioural scores. And I'll just show you the results now. So this is the results from the Western Aphasia Battery from the WAB that I mentioned, where it looks at aphasia severity. So on the side here, we've got the WAB scores. So 0 at the bottom and 100 at the top. And generally a higher score is better than a lower score. And then in these columns here, we have the brain health ratings. So 0 would be that we didn't see any white matter hyperintensities. And then 1 would be the mild, 2 would be the moderate, and 3 is the severe. So you can see that on average, people who either had no white matter hyperintensities or just mild white matter hyperintensities generally scored better on the WAB than people who had more severe white matter hyperintensities. And it gradually goes down as the severity of the white matter hyperintensities goes up. So this is showing us that maybe people who have a slightly more healthy brain might do better on the WAB. And next we've got the PNT, so the Philadelphia Naming Test. And just like before, we've got the scores on the side here. So it goes from 0 up to 60 here, and a higher score is better. And you can see in this, we have a very similar pattern as before. So people who have no white matter hyperintensities tend to score better, and a little bit worse if you have mild, and then quite a lot worse if you have moderate or severe white matter hyperintensities. And then we also have the average words per minute. So that again, with the scale on the side here, so the bottom is 0, so that would be if in 1 minute you didn't say any words at all. And at the top, we've got 100, so that would be if you said 100 words in a minute. And again, we've got the same pattern as before, so it gets the amount of words produced per minute gets gradually lower as the amount of white matter hyperintensities in the brain increases. So it's quite similar effects in all those behavioural tests. But what does this actually mean? So we can say from this data that there does seem to be a relationship between brain health and aphasia. So people with worse brain health tend to have maybe more severe aphasia or do a little bit worse on naming or a little bit worse in fluency tests. But that doesn't mean that brain health directly affects aphasia, just that there's a relationship between the two. So there's quite a lot of different reasons why this might be. And it's likely that people who have worse brain health might have had a worse stroke to start with. So a lot of the factors that affect brain health, like we talked about at the beginning, like BMI or high blood pressure, also affect strokes as well. So if people have a slightly worse stroke, it might be that actually their movement is restricted a little bit and they can't get out and about in the community more. So they maybe just don't interact with very many people. And it might be this interaction with others that's causing the differences in behavior. So we're not really sure whether it's the brain health that's causing these effects or whether the brain health is just related to these effects. And it can be, like I said at the beginning, very variable. So there's some people who have really, really good brain health. They don't have any of these white matter hyperintensities, but still have very severe aphasia and vice versa. So it's quite a complex thing, but it is good to say from this data that there does seem to be some kind of relationship. And we know that there are obviously other factors which are important in aphasia recovery as well. I know those of you who came to the last lunch bunch where Laurelie talked about age being an important factor. And we know from a lot of our studies that you guys have helped with that obviously speech and language therapy is a huge factor in aphasia recovery. But it might be useful to think about our brain health and our overall health alongside some of these factors as well. So it might be something to consider if you're also doing therapy to maybe try and incorporate some of these kind of do more exercise or reducing your BMI or your high blood pressure might be helpful alongside these other factors. So just a quick mention about future directions. So in the future, I'd like to look at a few other things. So I mentioned that obviously aphasia therapy is really, really important in recovery. And at this study, we just looked at one time point. So we just looked at you doing either the WAB or the PNT or speaking out loud just at one time. So I'd quite like to look at how this brain health interacts with aphasia recovery. So that's when I'd like to look at the polar data. So when people came in and had therapy, I'd be interested to see if the people who did really well in the therapy and had a lot of therapy gains, whether that's related to brain health or not. And I'd also be interested in looking at whether brain health changes over time. So there's some research suggesting that these white matter hyperintensities can be reversed. So maybe if you have a lot of these, if your overall health improves, so you do a lot of exercise and lower your BMI, that they might start to go away. And some research is suggesting that they just gradually get worse over time, and particularly as you get older. So for those of you who've come into the university lots of times from different scans, I'd be quite interested in looking at how these markers change over time and whether they generally get better or generally get worse. So hopefully we can look at that in some future projects. So there's still plenty of research questions to answer, and it's a fairly new topic in aphasia research. So hopefully with your guys' help, we'll be able to address some of these questions here at the Aphasia Lab. So I just want to say thank you to everyone who helped with this research, but obviously the biggest thank you has to go to everyone who participated in these research studies. I know a lot of you have taken up lots of time and participated in a lot of different projects. So none of this would be possible without all of you guys. So thank you very much. And thank you for listening. I'd be happy to answer any questions if anyone's got any.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hetherington. That was fabulous. I'm going to stop the recording.